Welcome to the betonme podcast, the ultimate resource for softball players looking to take control of their training and reach their full potential. I'm your host, Krista Stoker, and on this show, we'll be discussing everything from taking a holistic approach to your training to data-driven strategies for maximizing and growing yourself not only on the field, but off. At S2 Breakthrough, we believe that athletes should lead their own journey and push past any perceived ceilings on their talent. So join us as we explore the world of softball player development and help you bet on yourself. Because when you bet on yourself, you can't lose.
I like talking to outside people. Well, I always love to have the S2 person on the podcast. And I'm super excited about today. Laura and I were just catching up about sort of how to narrow our topic today to just 20 to 30 minutes. And so I think today will be a good introduction into the concept. I actually think we've changed how we describe ourselves a bit, but we're sort of known as this like data-driven place that people come to train. And conversations that we have internally a lot are about what that means and maybe a misunderstanding or a too limited viewpoint that people sort of take into consideration when they think of data-driven. And then also because we really are a training facility, the other thing I would say is sort of like the data analytics approach. While I might do that a little bit with my travel ball team, or we help colleges do some things like that, that's not also exactly what we're talking about when it comes to our training. So we're just going to dive into that a little bit because I think it's really important for coaches and athletes to understand that. And obviously no one better to talk about it than you because you are the person that has to do it all for us. So, okay, I'm going to start all the way back in the beginning. And I think even in the second episode of this podcast, we talked about this story because it does crack us up. I don't know if it cracks you up, but it makes me laugh, which is we hit a time with S2 where we just felt like, I don't think we were looking for data driven. Honestly, that was probably not the right way to look at it. But what we were searching for is information on what is good. Pitching and specifically was kind of driving the boat at that point. And we met you and eventually we're like, we have to bring Laura on staff. And the joke is, it's funny because it's true, is that your initial, when we described what your job description, it was like duties as needed, because Ashley and I were like, we've never had a person like this on staff. This isn't, it was really new for us to think. So maybe just give, obviously I'm sure this could be its own podcast and 30 minutes on its own, but a brief summary of sort of where you were before and then sort of coming into S2, and then maybe just a quick little dive into how that has evolved over the past few years at S2.
Yeah, good one. So 2019, I was a department chair at a local university, in an academic role that I sort of always thought I was, most prepared for going through graduate school. And I had a fellow coworker who basically was neighbors with you and Matt and was like, I saw a Michigan flag. I need to go over and introduce myself. This is what she was saying. And somehow that connection with her and Matt happened in a conversation of softball and data. And, basically, she was like, you guys have to meet each other. So it took until January of 2019 to make that happen, despite working together a couple of years. And I think you mentioned too, I think your kids had, hand, foot, and mouth disease.
Hand, foot, mouth, of course. Yeah, just like perfect. A true typical S2 fashion.
Right. Yep. A very typical, S2 day. So it was just me and Ashley in the room at that time. You were on the phone and I just remember having this conversation about, all the things that you guys wanted to do and talking about my background and just thinking this is cool. And at the time in my brain, I thought maybe we'll just do some research together. They're 20 minutes down the road. What a great opportunity to collaborate. And it was, a couple months went on and I think we all kind of just looked at each other like, do you want a job? Do I want a job? Do I want to leave this? And it just sort of evolved into, I think, a natural question of do we want to do this for real, essentially? And I was at a point in my career where I was, open to making a change and ready to make a change. And June of 2019, here I arrived on S2's door. And duties as assigned as appropriate. I think the first thing you guys asked me to do was you're going to have to present a pitch doc here in a few weeks on an assessment process that we haven't built yet. So can you do that? That was fun. That was a really good introduction to, I think learning some of the questions that you guys had as coaches and, some of the ways I think in which pitching, that direction needed to evolve, and hitting as well. But obviously pitching was at our forefront. And really the last couple of years have just been, boy, it's been a lot of just trying and failing. I feel like I've done more true like scientific experimentation in the last couple of years than I've done in a really long time because of the freedom to do that. I think in the academic environment, the penalty for, no results, the penalty for, not having things done in a timely manner is pretty severe. It's pretty hefty in terms of its impact on your career. And I think for me personally, coming to S2 Breakthrough and being able to do this stuff, implement things, try it, fail, try new technology, see how it manifests. There's a lot of freedom in that. There's a lot of, security essentially. And like, we're all just trying this for the first time, let's throw it out there and see what sticks and see what works. And we can always go back and refine that process. And I think the last couple of years have been a lot of that, just a lot of trying and a lot of failing. But yeah, I think coming out of academia and that very, strict and kind of rigid world of you've got to publish or perish, you've got to get your stuff out there, feeling like we can take this journey and be at a point a few years later to now get to this point with data, get to this point with our biomechanics product that, it's going to be done, in my opinion, the right way, as opposed to, just trying to get that out there and get that published. We want to make sure it's really, really good, solid, impactful information. I think that's been the last couple of years for us, is making sure we can do that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think when Ashley and I first were diving in as just coaches who didn't really have background in data, and data and tech were very new for softball when you came on. I would say, like, although there are lots of solutions out there, probably more than the pioneers in the baseball front had access to when they started, softball is still limited in our options compared to where baseball is now in the tech. And so I think for Ashley and I as just coaches, we were like, okay, we want to be data driven. We want access to technology. We bought ball flight monitors. We just threw them down. We had no idea whether they were good or bad. We found someone that had access to wearable sensors. We were like, oh, let's just put this on our pitchers and see what happens. And so that was really the start. And I think when we first realized, like, we need someone else here because we don't know how to navigate what we're looking at. But maybe just walk through from your standpoint, maybe from a scientific standpoint, what is data? So when people say things like, we are data driven, I tend to then hear sort of what is reflected back to me if we say things like, we're just taking into consideration all the data. What people will reflect back is what that person's pitch velo is, what that person's exit velo is, like launch angle is a hot topic, but there's a very limited viewpoint. And I always say now it's very clear to me, like that's just the tiniest part of the data. So maybe just talk through like what constitutes as data, what are the types of things that you could take into consideration. Then we can walk through sort of how we have navigated what we take into consideration.
Yeah, it's a good one. Data is really, it's anything. It's any point of information that you take from an athlete. I think of just asking, any of our athletes, hey, how are you feeling today? Great. That's a data point. Even if it's not something formally written down, that at least informs me like, okay, she's feeling great today. We can move on with her program. I think we tend to think that data is this, it has to be this very complicated entity that's in, mass quantities. It has to be visualized. And that's not always the case. I think it can be just as simple as, I'll use our wellness questionnaires. Those are just surveys, essentially. The athletes fill out themselves. And, it is a key point for us in our data process because it's important for us to know how is she responding to that training program. And that's not complex data. It's simply how tired are you today? What is your stress level like today? And those are things that, we ask from the athlete. It's not even like we use anything besides a Google form to collect it from them. So it doesn't have to be that complicated. And, I always, when I hear data driven, I do sort of like, I have this sort of natural reaction of data driven to me. Sometimes that phrase, I think, as you mentioned, implies a very rigid approach that you've got to take the data. The data is the only thing that really lets you make decisions. And I think that's just a very extreme interpretation of data driven. In my opinion, data driven and data informed are very similar to each other. That you've got to have the, this evidence-based coaching concept. You've got to have, what is your coaching expertise? What is the art of coaching? The things that you know in your gut to be true, the things that you've seen with your own two eyes that are just as valid as anything else. What does the athlete need? What does that pitcher need? What does that hitter need? That's very individual to her. And then what what does data say, whether that is published research, something that you're going out and seeking in the published world, or it's data you collect yourself. You're either reinforcing what your coaching art is telling you, or the data is challenging you on that coaching art a little bit. And I think it's when coaches can be comfortable in being challenged by data that may not support things that either they've assumed or they've thought for a long time. I think that can unnerve them a little bit. And I can see why, right? I mean, it's something that you've held that belief a long time. It's an approach you've taken a number of times, and that data can tell you that maybe there's an easier way, or maybe there's a better way to do that. So I always think of data informed, data driven, and data informed to me say like, okay, the data is helping us to navigate this story. It's not telling the story for us. It's not dictating everything that we do, but it's a really, really key important part because it can span so many different types of data. So between wellness questionnaires and a movement assessment, which are very qualitative. They are sort of based in the eye of the beholder, right? Whether it's the human being scoring them or it's the athlete responding. Those are very subjective, and those still have value and still have meaning. The objective data, when paired with subjective data, is really critical. The objective data, things that you get out of Repsodo and HitTrax and pitch velo, exit velocity, spin, break, all of that, bat speed. That very objective stuff is also important because that is criteria that coaches will look at, as you're going through a recruiting process or just from a performance standpoint. Those have to be matched with the subjective stuff. Can't be one or the other. It can't be, one at the exclusion of anything else, but they have to match up. And I think the subjective part of, taking the human component, the athlete component of it is important. And you need some objective to help telling you if your coaching program is on the right track, essentially.
Yeah, for sure. I often think, and I think we could probably walk through kind of some specific examples of where this happened to us, but just broadly, I'm a coach, I am a parent, I'm an athlete, and I'm trying to navigate data. I think the first thing that happens is we collect whatever, wellness questionnaires, we put down a unit of something to measure the ball flight, we do something, and it feels like a lot, right? So like I get back, out of just our wellness questionnaire and Repsodo pitching, I could get back 30 data points, right? So like suddenly I have all of this data. How do you suggest, someone navigates what to pay attention to? So as I'm trying to figure out like what data should I pay attention to, or how do I use this data? What are some things that you would have coaches, parents, athletes think about when they're trying to decide what to use?
Yeah, I think the context of that data and the environment it's collected is really important. I'm going to come back to the subjective for a second, but I think objective measures, like for example, I'll use a bat swing sensor. I'll use a blast sensor as an example. The context of a piece of technology like that's really important. Anytime that you're hitting under any different condition, tee, front toss, live, the condition matters. The output of that particular data variable matters because the context matters. And I think matching those things up are important. If you're, just as a simple example, your tee exit velocity is a lot higher than your live, at bat speed or exit velocity. Like that should tell you that you've got a breakdown somewhere in terms of the conditions. I think from a pitching standpoint, it's a little different because the conditions can change, but they're more likely to change between game environment and training environment versus within a training environment. And you're talking about managing fatigue and workload and things that impact that pitcher sort of externally. And I think the context and the environment in which that data is collected is really important. We obviously trust this technology to be collecting accurate and reliable data, but we've also got to know is how was it collected? Was it in an environment in which the athlete should be expected to succeed and do her best, or was it not? Was she super tired? Did she have a practice beforehand? It just, to me, it provides context of knowing essentially what was the environment in which it was collected in. I think the other things like the wellness questionnaires and subjective questionnaires, in my opinion, I always like that data. I like to sit and wait a little bit instead of taking action immediately, because I think it's really easy to see, and we do this, we flag, or I should say athletes respond that they have some arm pain. And so on that, I reach out immediately and say, like, can you tell me what's going on? General soreness, we tend to just watch for a pattern. I think that's probably a great place to start, is to start collecting the data. Don't do anything with it. It's hard enough even just to get the data collected, especially on a a tight schedule, a large number of athletes. There's enough barriers just to getting the data in general. Just start collecting it. See what patterns emerge. See what things you see are interesting. Unless you have a very specific question that you're trying to answer, collect it. See what emerges. Find a way to put it in a visualization that helps you to make sense of it. For example, Rapsodo pitching data. You probably want to look at those trends over time, especially for velocity. You want to see how things are growing. And so you have to decide if on the spot or long term, how do the way that data is visualized, does it help you to see those patterns first and foremost? And I think, taking a data point, turning that into information, which is informing you about that athlete, and then turning that into, knowledge and wisdom of how to use it is a whole other level of application. But I think the hardest part is getting started on collecting it, seeing what patterns evolve. Are you asking the right questions of your athletes? Are you using the right technology to measure what you think you should be? Start there. That's at least a place to collect it and look for patterns, as a place to start.
Yeah, I think from our own journey, one of the first things that we did, we started this assessment process, and we had a bunch of mobility exercises. I would say they started pretty mobility heavy, and we collected. That first fall you were there, we collected mobility on, I don't know, over 100 athletes. Yeah, everyone. And like a month later, 2 months later, the biggest thing that we started asking as coaches, and I think this is a really important part for coaches to think about, is how did we use that information? Did we use that information? Did it inform anything helpful? And at that time, we said no. We didn't feel like our assessment was targeted enough to tell us the changes that we should be making in our training programs to, individualize the program or things like that. And so what we did at that point is change our assessment process to try to tie it closer to what we felt like would help inform the coaches. So I think that that's a mistake that coaches make a lot. I think there's kind of two ends of it. One is sort of, I think what you alluded to, which is I collect something and with no context, I just start saying that it means something to the athlete. So one exit velo that was collected that day without looking at any trends or anything. I just start to make some big deal out of that for that athlete. Or, I haven't collected pitching data for that athlete for a really long time, and she's throwing slow that day. And we just start without any context to make all of these changes to the program. So I think there's that extreme of it, which is just very out of context. And then I think there's the extreme where you collect data, so much data that you're not doing anything with it. And it's not really informing anything. It's not helpful data, which I think both sides can be equally bad, I think. And I think the first side, obviously, you can make some really bad, uninformed decisions that you're claiming to be driven by data. And I think the other side of it can be, one, I think it's not good for buy-in for the athletes. So that's something I think about a lot, which is if you're putting something down or collecting information on the athletes, and then they're never seeing how that applies to them, they don't understand, right? They start to feel like a science experiment, or you're not using that information. And so I think that particular side, I don't know that we've ever done the in the moment side too much, but the other side of it is something we've really had to navigate, which is even our wellness questionnaires, right? Which is something that we collected in the background, and we didn't always have a flagging system. We didn't always know how to follow up with athletes on that. And so we had to build, or you had to build, I don't know, you had to build a notification system for us, so that we didn't just if an athlete says my arm hurts and no one ever says anything to her about that, what is the point of the wellness questionnaire? And so I think being able to use data like that. So maybe what are some suggestions you have for coaches or resources that they could use for how do I find that middle? How do I collect data where I'm looking at trends over time? And how do I get it to feed information, or what kind of questions should coaches or athletes be asking about data? I don't know if you have thoughts on that to sort of help guide them.
So I think in terms of supporting coaches in this quest to understand data, to utilize data, I think the first component is, one, you have to know your technology. So if you're using a piece of technology, whatever that might be, I think understanding its reliability, its consistency, knowing if the data that you are collecting on the spot, especially, is it accurate? Does it make sense? Is there a common sense component to what it's telling you? And I think if you can at least start there, that is the data that's coming at you on the spot from that piece of technology, making sense for where that athlete is in her journey, what level she's playing at. The common sense check, I think, first and foremost, is a good place to start. Technology is going to have misreads, right? There's always going to be potential errors. Some are more frequent than others. But just knowing that what is a misread, what is a good piece of data, just starting there, so that you don't judge or make any decisions, in your coaching implementation that's based off of wrong data. I'd rather have no data than wrong data, right? I'd rather just, move forward in my coaching, my art of coaching, and my instincts than be informed by data that's inaccurate. And so I think starting there, knowing your technology, I think, the people that make these products want you to be a happy customer. And so utilizing them as resources, asking them for support, it's important that the use of technology and the comfort level from coaches grows. I think the context in which that data is collected is important too. I think understanding if it's, is it related to in-game performance, training performance? How are you utilizing that data? What can you expect from it? We typically see improvements in performance in the game, just simply because of adrenaline, right? There's lots of physiological factors that can change, an athlete's data throughout the game process. And I think just knowing those two environments in that context is important. And I think, you touched on this a little bit of, especially with like wellness questionnaire, subjective data, what is actionable now? What is something that you need to pay attention to right now? And what is maybe data that you don't need to pay attention to right now, that you're more collecting, as you said, kind of in the background? And I do think our wellness questionnaires are a great version of that. We have those flags like, are you in pain? Do you have arm soreness, that we act on immediately because they require immediate intervention, right? We don't let athletes hang around in pain, have arm pain or arm soreness that they are not able to resolve themselves. And so those are pieces of data that we act on immediately. But there's other points of data. We talk about stress and nutrition and some of these things about their sort of, day in and day out lives that we can utilize on the back end to understand their performance story. If we're seeing dips or gains or whatever in velo, pitch velo, exit velo, does that subjective data support that? Right? Is their performance going up when they're rested, when they're eating well, when their stress is low? What is it that helps them to understand their own story? So there's components of it that are actionable for us, but then there are components of it that we have to give back to the athlete so that they can understand, okay, when I am a week out from my period, this is how I feel. When I am, when I've had a tough week at school, this is how I feel. And I think it helps them to set their own expectations, for what their bodies can produce and what their performance might look like. I think understanding what do you have to take action on right now and what can maybe sit and wait and maybe just is in the background until you see a pattern that emerges and something that you want to take action on. Not every piece of data from the start needs action. I think just start collecting, understanding what you're collecting, seeing where it goes right and wrong, and seeing what patterns emerge.
Yeah. I think the trend element is really, really important. I think it's in some ways maybe the hardest. So I think it's a barrier for coaches. I think, there are solutions to it that doesn't have to be the coach doing it or the athlete doing it, which is some of the technology has places that you can go look at trends for reports. There's reporting companies, you can go online and hire someone relatively cheap that could put it into visualization. But I think any mistakes that we've made, and we've made a lot of mistakes with data, and I think it's important. And any mistakes we've made is when we've gotten away from looking at the trends and we've focused in on, one piece of information. So for instance, technology makes mistakes, and we've missed some of those mistakes when updates went through and there were things were starting to flip or, things like that. We've made mistakes by not looking at how the trends were happening to see like something's happening here. This is not true that the pitcher is throwing it with this different type of break or that type of thing. We've missed that when we focus in just on the moment. And I definitely see on social media, coaches making the same mistakes where they post something that's like such an outlier, right? So, you reference exit velo, which is in hitting is more where I sit. And that happened a lot where pieces of technology were, showing teenagers, 12, 13-year-olds hitting 80. And we have to ask ourselves, when we look at, there's more information. It's not as much as baseball, but, an LSU, or there are certain teams where they share their in-game data. And if those athletes are popping mostly just in the 70s, like, is this 12-year-old that usually hits at 60 hitting 80? And it's not to say, we have athletes that hit it in the 80s, but, just asking yourself of those outliers, and you'll see that so much clearer from trends, which I think is just so important. I think even to myself, of weighing myself, right? So like, as I tried to optimize my health, I weigh myself. If I just went, every 2 weeks I stood on the scale and weighed myself, and I just went based off of that without any trends, like, you change weights every day. Like, I could have just eaten, drank a lot of water the day before or something like that. You're not seeing the trends. And I think that is really, really important, is to try to collect information and make sure that you're seeing an actual trend, and you're not just, looking at these outliers. It's not to say that sometimes, like, if an athlete pops a PR and it's real and we feel like really good in it, we can celebrate it, but we're really trying to celebrate trends over time and to really pay attention to trends. So we might see a trend. One thing that could happen is a pitcher comes in and that day she's throwing slower. And so just like what you said, it's like, okay, let's think of all the information before we freak out and we're like, I'm throwing slow. Let's think about all the information. Whether they're things did you do today? Maybe that athlete's sore that day. Maybe she's on her period that week. Like, there's a lot of different things to feed into that. And we're not going to panic ever, but we're definitely not going to make action or take action on an athlete's training program until we see a trend there. And then if a trend, like a pitcher is trending down in velo, we'll start to ask questions. Is it the training program? Is it the environment? Like, what all is feeding into this that we can change? So I think that's the biggest mistakes I made. And I don't know if you have specific examples of things that we've done there, but is when we have gotten just in the moment, or we've not been looking at trends, that's been, I think, where we've made the biggest mistake, or where we find coaches and athletes kind of making the biggest mistakes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think when we talk about player development, the development part is really important. And that is a journey that is, it's not linear. There will not be this beautiful linear slope of, pitch velo or exit velo or whatever the metric is that you're chasing. That's also just not the body, right? That's not development. That's not how our body evolves in terms of affecting some of these performance variables. There is an absolute, up and then down and up and then down. And if you don't look at trends, then you're constantly chasing this sort of false sense of, this is the number that I have to hit. This is the number that I have to hit, without realizing that, you could be pushing your ceiling up and up and up every week. And you're just doing that through this gradual transition of, ups and little downs, big ups and little downs. And that's a perfectly viable way to achieve great performance, and that is development. You have to be able to look at the trends. You have to want to look at the trends in development. Even if those trends are sometimes scary, we absolutely have had athletes where, we have gone, maybe a 4-week block, and either we got busy or we had other things going on in our business that we missed. And we watched this players, if we look at the trend, we watched that exit velo go down, that pitch velo go down. She's getting more and more stressed. She's sore. She's in arm pain. And we have to take those steps to intervene. Sometimes that's simply just educating the athlete. It doesn't have to be a complicated end result. Sometimes it's just saying that, lifting 6 days a week is not what you need right now. And being very thoughtful in our education, making sure that pitching through pain and playing through pain is not normalized. And just getting them to understand that you can control some of this data, right? You can control the non-performance part of the data to a certain extent on a daily basis. What we want to see is that trend, and trends can be scary, right? Especially if they're not going in a direction that you think they should go. But that's how it's, to me, I always say it's mutual accountability. It's accountability for us to know if our training programs are right, if they're doing the right things, if they're influencing the right things. It's accountability for our athletes. Are they showing up consistently? Are they executing the program well? And that's how we hold each other accountable. I think if you are imposing your coaching methods onto any athlete and you're not measuring the end result of it, how do you know that your methods work, right? We know that a lot of the stuff that we do is successful because we measure the impact. And I think that is a really important part of confidence in your coaching methods. There's confirming that you're on the right path, and there is adjusting your path because the data said, maybe you need to, make a couple of tweaks here. That athlete isn't responding in the way you think they should.
Yeah. And I think when you use data in the moment like that, like one of the things that we get asked a lot is, how do you get athlete buy-in? Or like there's a fear of showing athletes the data, or, just navigating that component is tricky. And I think that was real for us when a pitching monitor first got put out and the data was just there constantly, or, hitting ball flight data was just constantly being able to be seen by the athletes. There was a real adjustment period at first where we had to teach athletes, do not freak out every time you see something not good, because you got to just let it run in the background. And what I will say is, for the most part, like pitchers that come to S2, for instance, do not panic if they see that velo is down, because they understand velo. They see it all the time. They understand that it trends differently. They also understand that if it really is trending down, we will intervene. We will have conversations, like we're in there. But to see that, like, we have remote athletes that fly in, their velo's down the next day. They just traveled. They didn't sleep good. They're not in their own bed. Like, who knows what they ate, and there's an understanding that that's very normal. For the most part, at our assessments, athletes throw slower than, pitchers don't throw as hard at our assessments because they traveled in to do that. So I think if you can feel confident, if your athletes feel like, as a coach, you are doing something with the information and that you are taking into account and you are educating yourself and it's feeding into what you're programming, you can learn this really trusting relationship with all of it and not panic every time you get bad results. So I think even, we had moments where that happened with our wellness questionnaire, where coaches were like, why is everyone hurt? And we said, I don't think everyone's hurt. I think they're just being truthful for the first time. Right. And they're saying they're in pain. And really we've been able to, we've, tinkered with the way we ask questions to make sure that we make our athletes tell us when they're having pain and soreness, and they're not hiding things like that. And I think the way we've been able to create that trust is, listen, we're not shutting you down. We're not asking for this information from that reason, but we want to know so that we can ask the right questions of, like, hey, why do you think you're that sore? Was there something that went up? How can we help you navigate that? And typically it's just something that we can navigate together. So I think that that's really important when you're collecting data that frequently, is just learning that relationship in your training environment with data and not making athletes. You could have a session, like a pitch design session, for instance, where you're saying, we're going to look at every pitch and we're trying to get -8, right? Like, we're trying to get every pitch -8 because that's what we're doing right now. We're working on a drop ball pitch design session, and that is what we're doing. Or, I've done in hitting where, like, are some of our really, really high level athletes, like, a successful rep here is this exit velo. Like, we are going for that and we're doing that. But for athletes to understand that's in a training context, and then some days we're just throwing and we're collecting data to watch trends, and I think that that's a really important dynamic for coaches to navigate, because we've made mistakes there for sure. And it makes you a lot less scared of data if you understand how to, like, use it in different ways and really, like, walk the line with your coach, with your athletes, instead of using it, like, against them in some way, or they feel like it's like a test all the time.
Right. Or they feel like it's punitive in some way. I think that's a really big thing to avoid is, and I think we see this with all different types of athletes too. I think, whether they have, underlying sensitivity to seeing data. Sometimes you have these really high overachievers. They're very grade focused. There's all kinds of athlete profiles that might be, more or less sensitive to seeing that data. But it really is a trust relationship to know that I'm going to collect this data on you, and I think that's where assessments sometimes they get a little tricky, because they feel like they're being evaluated by me. And I have to keep saying, I'm just collecting the data. I am not making any interpretations right now. We're just collecting the data, just getting a baseline. But it's tough. They feel like they're in an evaluation. And I think the culture that, the youth system has created with, data and evaluation and attaching those two things together, it does make that relationship with data and training really tricky, because you have to navigate that carefully, and you have to navigate that carefully on an individual basis. Not every single athlete is going to have a positive response to seeing their data immediately. And they may have periods where they don't want to see their data at all. It's just something that they'd rather just focus on their execution of it versus the outcome, and leave the coach to have the responsibility of seeing that outcome and judging whether or not things are on the right path. And I think it's a huge trust relationship. You're absolutely right. Yeah. And it comes from not using data in a punitive sense. That's where I get frustrated with things like preseason fitness tests, et cetera, because once the metric becomes the goal, it kind of stops being a good metric. Right. And so when you start having this goal of everybody has to hit 80, that's just not everybody's story. Everybody has to throw 70. That's not everybody's story. You're trying to be able to give them a sense of their own journey. And that means trusting that data and trusting the coach to deliver that in a way that's not punitive, that doesn't have a negative association to it. Yeah. So
I think we'll kind of finish here. We could talk forever. We could go on and on. Right. This will be like the longest podcast ever. I was like, this is 16 more minutes. I'm like, yeah, we're going too long. Okay, so, but I think I coach a travel team. It's 18U. It's pretty high level. Every person on my team goes through S2 training. So they're pretty bought into this approach of training, especially my pitchers probably. And I bring Rapsodo to every tournament. And so I think this is a kind of a way, I think, to summarize a good, healthy relationship with data, which is, I wish we could get in-game data, but we can't. And so we'll put Rapsodo down as they're warming up. And so what it tells, and I think this took some time, it takes some time with each pitching staff throughout the year for us to navigate how we're using this. But the first thing is, okay, are your pitches doing what they typically do? And sometimes the answer is no, something's off. You're tired, your timing's different, whatever. And so if the answer is no, it's not, oh, you're not going to throw this game. It's your turn to throw. So, okay, how can we change what we call in the game to make you successful? Because we just have more information. Your rise doesn't have backspin today. So fine. What's plan B when that pitch is not doing that? Or maybe first it's like, okay, let's use the warm up to see if we can get it to have backspin, right? Like we can make some changes with that feedback. And if we can't, what's plan B? I think too, like we saw in the fall, travel ball, for instance, is crazy. And I don't even overthrow my pitchers, and it's still crazy. And so what we would see on day 2 was like a drop off in velo. And so we would have a conversation of like, there's no punishment. Like this is reality. And you can't just throw harder if you want to throw harder. That's not how it works. And so it fed a lot of things. It fed, okay, can we make sure our training, maybe we have to make some training adjustments going into summer to make sure there's not a big velo drop on day 2. Maybe we have to change again how we call because our fast isn't as fast. So we need to rely more on our changeup or our off speed or whatever different pitches you have. We have to be a little different. Maybe our location has to be really pinpoint because we can't just blow it by them. Whatever those things are, we can have conversations. And so we had a winter tournament, which we don't do very often, but we decided to do it to check in. And I didn't bring Rapsodo. And ultimately, I'll say it lost us the game. I don't know, but my pitch calling wasn't the same as it was. And my pitchers, we really talked about that. And they wanted it because that's how we sort of like tier things. And I think it does happen sometimes before games that they don't have a pitch they normally have. Their velo is down a tier. All of these things that we could really be mad at them for and treat it like we're going to punish them for that. Or we could, I think you have to be really careful of that is exactly how am I reacting to this as a coach? If I'm like, ooh, yikes, you're not throwing this hard. Like, even if I don't punish them, if that's my response, I've lost that trust with them. And so I think just, that dynamic is really important. It can be a very, very powerful tool, but you do have to walk that line of like how you're using it. And I think using it on the spot, using it like punitively, as you mentioned, we see that a lot. And I think it has a really big backfire. That's not what we're talking about here. It's supposed to be just more information for you to help that athlete, especially these, maybe if I'm talking the College World Series and I'm getting flagged that this pitcher is losing something, I don't pitcher in that. And that's reality because of something I've seen. But when we're talking about teenagers, we got to walk that line pretty carefully because it's supposed to be being used to help them for development.
Yeah, absolutely. Non-punitive at best, neutral reactions when the data is not what you need it to be, and reinforce the positive all the time. When they do something well and that data shows it, praise, lots and lots of just, yes, that's right. And when it doesn't, it doesn't. It's not something to, like you said, you can't get mad at them for that. It's managing coach expectations. It's when I hear a pitcher, they come in for an assessment and they're like, I have 7 pitch types. I'm like, no, you don't, right? What you actually have are probably 4 decent pitch types and the rest are, the same. Right. But the managing of expectations of that, if I'm coaching that pitcher, then I'd like to know that what I'm instructing her to do is actually what she's trying to do and actually what she's accomplishing, instead of just hammering these things that she has to learn and these pitch types that she has to learn. The data lets me know that, all right, she doesn't need all of those pitch types. The labels are not important, but she has these, X, Y, and Z tools that are really powerful. And that's what I'm going to lean in on. I just think it's efficiency. It's managing expectations, and you build that trust relationship over time, and that's why trends are so important.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I have to cut us off because otherwise this is going to be way too long. So we're going to end there, but definitely we have infinite topics for Laura and I to talk about, I think, and I probably am going to force the next one to be about periods. So if you're ready for 30 minutes of period talk, then join us for the next time I make Laura join us. But we have a lot of conversations because a lot of interesting things have come up over the years for us. So I'm excited to have you back on eventually, and maybe that time we'll hit our goal. But for now, enjoy the longest betonme podcast to date about data, and not shockingly about data, I guess. This is pretty good. So, all right, until next time, thank you, Laura, for everything, and we'll see you next time.
Well, S2 Nation, thanks for joining another episode of the Bet On Me podcast. Go out today, bet on yourself, and remember, when you bet on yourself, you can't lose.